Movement requires integration of the cerebellum, basal ganglia, and the cortex. Stay tuned because today you will discover new findings of the cortical homunculus and new ideas of neurologic rehabilitation. Hi there, I'm Dr. Krista Burns, founder of the American Posture Institute and your host on the Virtual Neurology Summit. The purpose of the Virtual Neurology Summit is to provide healthcare professionals with brain-based solutions to get better neuroplastic results with your patients. I'm honored to welcome our next guest expert. Dr. Randy Beck is an internationally renowned expert in the field of clinical neuroplasticity and neuroplastic restructuring techniques. He graduated from North Central University with a PhD in psychoneuroimmunology. He subsequently completed postgraduate studies in non-invasive brain stimulation at Harvard University. Dr. Beck has authored 3 textbooks in functional neurology and has authored or co-authored over 30 published peer-reviewed manuscripts in academic journals. Clinically, Dr. Beck has developed an approach to delivering non-invasive brain stimulation that is both effective and safe and has helped thousands of people live better, more meaningful lives all over the world. Today, he'll be sharing with us the neurology of how we move. Dr. Beck, thank you so much for joining us as a speaker at the Virtual Neurology Summit. Please take it away.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on human movement, the neurology of how we move. I'm very excited to be able to present this to you. In this presentation, we're going to go through a review of the traditional understanding of how movement occurs. And then we're going to bring in some new information that has basically come to us probably in the last couple of years. And it's totally mind-blowing, and it's totally interesting and exciting, and it will impact on how future rehab is performed. So I want to welcome you to this presentation, and we'll get right into it because I only have a limited amount of time on this. So I'll be up here in the right-hand corner throughout the presentation. And then at the end, we'll have some questions answered. Okay, so we're going to start with an overview of how we understand movement occurs. So basically, in the motor cortex, we have these pyramidal cells that project down through to the spinal cord, where they then synapse with a lower motor neuron, which then comes out and causes muscle contraction through release of neurotransmitters at the muscle. And then the movement that is produced, the proprioception of that movement, and all the tendon pressures and movement of the muscles is then relayed back up through the spinal cord to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus back up into the somatosensory cortex. So we have this loop of motor activity, motor control, and then a feedback to tell the instigating motor control how its command has been processed, how the movement has happened. And was it accurate? And are there any changes in the environment that need to be considered to modify that movement? Okay, now, basically that motor cortex area was mapped back in the 1930s by Penfield, who was a surgeon who used brain surgeries to, use a direct stimulus on the brain, on the motor cortex, and to determine where his stimulus caused movement in the body. And from that, he mapped out this sort of cartoon-like homunculus, which he even called it a cartoon at the time, basically saying this is what we found, how the motor cortex is mapped. And as you can see, there are large areas of the motor cortex relegated to the hand, large areas relegated to the face and lips, somewhat smaller areas to the body and the legs. And in fact, the legs even scoop down into this central sulcus area, which means that if there's a sort of a tumor here, because we have both sides of the brain coming close together here. So in this area, if there is a tumor, it can affect both legs for the movement of both legs, not just one. So that's something to consider clinically when you're evaluating people to locate where issues might be presenting in the brain. Okay, now, so this is the motor cortex. Now, the sensory cortex. So we have pre-central gyrus. Here we have post-central gyrus. So the green is the post-central, and the blue is the pre-central. Now, blue is M1 or motor cortex, and then this is the somatosensory cortex back here, this post-central gyrus mapped over here. So it was mapped too, and it's quite similar. The map is quite similar. There are some differences, but relatively quite similar. Now, this was done back in the motor cortex mapped in the 1930s, sensory cortex 40s and 50s, roughly in those areas. Now, remember that so the somatosensory information for movement and tactile sensation is crucial for us to survive, because we need to know, was our motor command accurate? Was our motor command carried out properly? Did it accomplish the functional tasks that we wanted? So all this feedback has to come in. So the feedback's coming from the muscle receptors, it's coming from the proprioceptors, it's coming from your eyes and your sensation. All the stuff is accumulating in the somatosensory cortex to tell us, did we accomplish what we wanted to do? And, and are there minor changes in the environment right now that have happened since the command went out that need to modify those directions? And that is a complex system that we're going to get into now, that gives feedback. And so basically we have multiple systems that are involved to guide our movements and to make sure that our movements are efficient and accurate. So we have, again, this is the motor cortex here. It is sending down the axons from the pyramidal cells, which are going to then, in the spinal cord, synapse with the lower motor neurons, which are then going to send activity to the muscles. Okay? Now, and then that activity is going to feed back up. It's going to go through the brainstem to the cerebellum, to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus back up to somatosensory cortex. Now, this is important because there are modifications that happen in all of these areas that are that can, when they malfunction, present specific symptoms, and they can present specific and be involved with specific disease states. Okay, so let's go and break these down a bit more. So there's the basal ganglia. Now, basically, if I can simplify what the basal ganglia does, because it's very complicated. So information from the motor cortex and from other areas of the cortex project down to the striatum. Now, the striatum is a collection of different anatomical structures, but basically the striatum is mostly composed of, for movement purposes, the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia is composed of the globus pallidus, subthalamic nucleus, and substantia nigra. And the output nucleus, really, of the there's a few output nuclei of the basal ganglia, but the main output nuclei is the globus pallidus pars interna. Which has an output to the thalamus. Now, the job of the basal ganglia, if I can simplify it, extremely simplify it, is basically it gets information from the brain, from the cortex, that tells the basal ganglia what movements or what components of information the brain is going to need, the motor cortex is going to need in order to perform these movements accurately. So then the basal ganglia will interact with the thalamus and allow the thalamus to release the information that the brain needs, that the cortex needs in order to accomplish the movements. Now, we're talking about movement specific today, but the basal ganglia also deals with emotional release of information for emotions, release of information for um, a lot of different aspects of our life. So the basal ganglia are very important. And that's why when the basal ganglia doesn't function properly, for instance, in Parkinson's disease, we have movement disorders, but we also have some psychological issues in Parkinson's that are also caused by the dysfunction of the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia are very important. So then all of the information that's coming back into the brain from the periphery, other than smell, basically goes through the thalamus. So the thalamus is technically a relay station of information. So basal ganglia's job is to tell the thalamus, okay, what information to release, because if it's all released at the same time, results in confusion in the brain, confusion in the cortex. So there has to be some kind of a system in place that regulates the release of the information that's necessary. So that's the job of the basal ganglia. And then another component is the cerebellum. We'll go back up to this slide here. And we can see here the cerebellum is involved. Now, the cerebellum's major job in movement is a comparator, to compare the command that was given and the outcome of that command that happened in the muscles. So there is a feedback loop to the cerebellum, and then a feedback loop from the cerebellum to the thalamus, and then basically from the thalamus to the cortex. Once the basal ganglia tells the thalamus to release that information, it gets released back up to the cortex. So we have this complicated system of development that has happened to produce movements because of how important movements are in our lives and in our survival. All of these systems have developed to make sure that that movement is appropriate, accurate, efficient, all those things that when it all works right, we don't even notice all this is happening. But it's when there are problems in some of these systems that our movement starts to be affected, and then we start developing symptoms. We start getting movement disorders. We start obviously getting emotional disorders, all kinds of things that are connected. So understanding how all of these systems work is very important when we start to treat people for disabilities that are involving movement, or even training them to move better. So all of these systems are interacting, and they've evolved to help us perform better in our world. Okay, excellent. So as I was just stating, the basal ganglia plays the crucial role in regulating information flow to the thalamus, which in turn influences motor activity and other cognitive functions. So it's not just motor activity, it's a variety of cognitive functions that are also involved. And the thalamus is, again, acting as a relay station, relaying information back to the cortex. Now, does the thalamus alter the information? This is an area of discussion and controversy, I suppose. Does the thalamus? So we have these thalamocortical loops, thalamocortical projections that basically form the basis of the EEG activity that we can measure with an electroencephalogram. So there's a lot of research now looking at how the thalamus modifies the information it receives, or does it modify the information? And how is that modification utilized by the cortex in order to make sure that things are working right when we move? Now, the information that I've just presented to you is sort of the old, not necessarily old, but the standard outlook of how movement occurs. And I'm sure you've heard many, many renditions of this over the years. Now we're going to look at some changes in how the anatomy of the motor cortex is looked at and how the production of movement is actually produced. And in order to get to this point, we've used some advanced functional mapping techniques. And the two techniques that were used in the information that I'm about to present are resting state functional connectivity, which is basically an fMRI that is a neuroimaging technique that examines the temporal correlations of spontaneous brain activity. And it's used using blood oxygen level dependent signals or bold signals. So when the subject is at rest and is not performing a specific task. So we're looking at when one area of the brain activates and then another area activates roughly at the same time, or in a sequential manner. From that, we can tie together the activity of those two areas and assume that they're both involved in certain activities inside the brain, or they're both involved in the same network inside the brain. Let's put it that way. And then we've also combined resting state functional connectivity information with precision functional mapping, which is a neuroimaging approach that reliably estimates metrics of brain function from individual people via the collection of large amounts of data. So we look at collecting lots of different individuals in a group, and then we can average that stuff together. But that doesn't give us a lot of information based on how individuals either differentiate or how the networks are specifically connected in individuals. So we combine the two, the group averages and the individual information, to gain the information I'm about to tell you, which is quite exciting and quite interesting. And it's going to probably affect how rehab and how we understand, definitely, it'll affect definitely how we understand how the system works in the future. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is introduce, so we talked about networks a little bit. And so there are a variety of different networks that we know about, and these have been elucidated through neurological studies, fMRI studies, bold studies, those types of things. So we have a variety, and you've probably heard about a lot of these networks. So the default mode network, central executive network, salience network, dorsal attention network, ventral attention network, cingulate opercular network. Now, this is the one that we're going to focus on today, because this is the one that is associated with this new anatomical understanding of the motor cortex. And then the frontal parietal network. So there's all these networks that we are systematically determining exist inside the brain. And they're all sort of designated to certain functional activities inside the cortex, and dysfunction in these networks can result in development of specific symptoms, specific disease states, all of those things. So we need to sort of have an understanding of what these networks are. But today we're just going to focus mainly on this cingulate opercular network, or the CON, cingulate opercular network. So CON, the CON, is a brain network that's involved in the executive functions, particularly those related to action control or movement. Now, it's composed of regions of the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the medial superior frontal cortex, and anterior insula, sometimes extending to the frontal operculum. Now, basically, the CON is known for its role in top-down control of motor and cognitive functions, as well as processing painful stimuli, which is very interesting, because sometimes when motor control fails and we can't make the muscles in the proper order, the brain will produce pain to stop you from using those muscles. So it's a way of the brain interfering or stopping you from what it thinks is hurting you. Okay, so that's important. So the CON, I'm just going to review this one more time: dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, medial superior frontal cortex, anterior insula, and sometimes the frontal operculum. So that's the anatomical components of this network. Now, that's going to be important in a few minutes when we get down to what's going on in this new understanding of motor control. So basically, during voluntary movements, which are goal-directed actions initiated and controlled by the executive regions in the con, so we have to understand that there are a couple different types of movements. There's voluntary movements, and then there's non-voluntary or autonomic movements or automatic movements. And usually automatic movements are not really under our voluntary control, but they happen in a cascade-like manner. When a certain sequence of events is activated, then that sequence produces a cascade of activity that is out of our voluntary control. And it happens, so for instance, reflexive actions, that kind of stuff. So we're talking now about voluntary movements, okay? So, well, we will be talking about voluntary movements right now, but then we'll talk about how those voluntary movements and autonomic movements can actually be activated through the motor cortex, through this new understanding of how it works. So interestingly enough, let's talk about, so when we talk about goal-directed actions, what does that mean? Well, that means that we have, so I have a desire to move. I have a desire to do something, to move my hand to pick up a glass. Okay, so Randy wants to pick up the glass. That's the activity that is being generated inside the brain. And so the voluntary activity, when I think I want to pick up a glass, my voluntary activity is first detected in the rostral cingulate zone within the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. Now, remember here, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex is part of this con. So, and we usually think about the anterior cingulate cortex as the connection between the thinking brain and the emotional brain. So the desire is an emotion. We can classify that as an emotion. So the emotional brain dictates what we want to do, and then the sort of thinking brain, if I can call it that, will activate the appropriate muscles to make sure that that activity happens. So let's go back to how we detect. What is the order of detection when we actually look at where orders come from to move? So first of all, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, then the pre-supplementary motor area. Now remember, the supplementary motor area is sort of in this region here, Brodmann area 6 roughly. And remember, Brodmann area 4 and 5 were located in the motor cortex area. So primary motor cortex, sensory cortex. I remember by how Penfield identified them, he kind of went motor cortex, sensory cortex, supplementary cortex, and that's why they're ordered in that way, numbered in that way. So that pre-supplementary motor area doesn't actually have direct connections to the motor cells, to the cells in the so the lower motor neurons that control the motion of the muscles. So activity in pre-supplementary motor area does not cause direct specific motor movement. It just helps guide the activity of the motor cortex to make sure that the information or the command, the want to move, is followed through appropriately. Now, sometimes we think about this pre-supplementary area as providing what's called the motor engram of movement. So motor engram is basically all of the things that have to happen in order for that movement to occur. So for instance, when I want to reach for the glass, depending whether I'm sitting or standing, different postural muscles also have to activate. Different blood flow has to happen so that the muscles of my arm receive blood so that they can perform the motion that I want to make. So this is all part of that motor engram situation. So these motor engrams are all learned when we're learning, back when we're learning to move, learning to walk, learning to sit up, learning to reach for things back when we're, a child. So all of these things are happening at that time. So developing interconnections of these motor ingrams happening. And so that's, we think, the pre-supplementary motor area's job is to connect or hold the activity of these motor ingrams. And that's important because basically other things that are happening. Remember we talked about how different systems are controlling different aspects of movement. And so the basic ganglia, the cerebellum, how does all that happen? Well, it happens because we have efferent copies of motor control are produced that mirror the actual command coming out of the motor cortex. And so these efferent copies go to a variety of different places. So some efferent copy goes to the somatosensory cortex so that when information comes back to the somatosensory cortex, it can understand whether that command was carried out properly or not. Some of that information, some of that efferent copy goes to the cerebellum, and some of it goes to the striatum or the basal ganglia, as we talked about before. Now, what's very important about this efferent copy production is that there's very few systems in our body that produce efferent copies. And that's because producing efferent copies and maintaining all those systems is very, very expensive from an energy perspective. So only systems that are extremely important utilize efferent copy situations and maintain the pathways that are necessary to utilize efferent copy. So this is another thing that we need to understand, that how important movement is for our survival, because we have, basically embedded systems to make sure that there are copies and collateral controls in place to make sure that our movement is performed correctly, accurately, efficiently, and if there are deviations that have to happen while the movement is in actually even proceeding, those deviations can happen extremely quickly. Okay, so that's the system that we're talking about. It's very, very, very complicated. But let's look at this new understanding of what's happening in the motor cortex now. So basically, what we're finding, what they found in this new research, is that projections from the anterior motor cortex we're projecting to not just to muscle activity, but also to in various regions inside the motor cortex, not all of the motor cortex cells. So majority of the motor cortex cells were outlined as Penfield had described. They were active to perform directed, delicate, accurate movements, mostly of the lips, tongue, hands, those things where we need accurate movement, even movement of the eyes that needs to also be accurate. So what they found in this research study, which was published in Nature in 2023, and there are, I noted this reference back here, right here. So this is Nature 2023, and this is Gordon et al. Okay, so that's the reference that I'm referring to here. And so what they found was that motor cortex neurons projected not only to the perimeter, not only projected to the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord, but also projected to systems that will control other things, like the adrenal gland, for instance. And areas of the con that are responsible for physiological control, arousal, error perception, and pain. Remember, we talked about the con being that executive part of the brain. So we now have the certain areas of the motor cortex projecting directly into that network, that orbicular network, that in such a way that the understanding of what movement is about to occur can also activate different areas of the body that are going to be necessary to support that movement. So adrenal areas would activate to change blood flow, for instance. We would also have perhaps other postural muscles activating. Now, what was interesting is that, so when we look at the new outline here, this is the new homunculus that was discovered during this investigation. So we saw, or they saw, that to accomplish holistic whole body functions in the service of performing actions, these functions included action implementation. So action implementation is the actual control of the muscles that we wanted to move. And then postural and gross motor control axial muscles. They regulated arousal. They coordinated breathing with speech and other complex actions. And this is very important, controlled internal processes and organs such as blood vessels, stomach, and adrenal medulla, consistent with whole body metabolic and physiological control. So you got to think about movement in its whole, in the whole body situation. So let's say we're jogging, we're running. So yes, we have leg action, we have arm action, we have lungs working, diaphragmatic action, we have postural muscles that are keeping us upright, vestibular system activity. All that stuff has to be coordinated, and what this new study actually determined was that there are areas in the motor cortex that are actively doing that are actively projecting to the con to make sure that those activities are happening. Now, these areas here were not discovered before. They were not there, you see. It was all just motor movement before. Now it's understanding that motor cortex is also involved in activating the con and other areas in the motor cortex that are necessary to control, for instance, the opposition muscles that need to contract and relax in a regulated order. So activating from the con, activating the supplemental motor area to make sure that those motor engrams are all activating properly. So it's a very complex situation in this motor cortex, which we really didn't understand before, just because of the way that our understanding was of the motor cortex was that it was simply activating the pyramidal cells, activating the lower motor neurons for accurate movement. Now it is doing that. So there is basically, the way we're looking at the new stuff is we have two behavioral control systems which are interleaved in the human motor cortex. Now the first system is one that is well known, and that's the one we knew about, the effector specific circuits for precise isolated movements of highly specialized appendages, fingers, toes, and tongue. The type of dexterous motion that is necessary for speaking and manipulating objects, such as tools and holding a pen, writing, accurate movements that need to be happening. Now and there's a second integrative output system. Basically, they determine the somatocognitive action network, or SCAN, and it's more important in controlling the organism as a whole. So the SCAN integrates body control, motor and autonomic and action planning, consistent with the idea that aspects of higher level executive control might derive from movement coordination. In other words, in order to coordinate all these things, we have to activate, we can't sort of do it all at the same time, even though it has to be done all at the same time. So we have to have predetermined motor engrams in place that can activate, very, very rapidly and in a sequential order to make sure that the underlying structural and physiological activities that need to happen during movement are happening. So basically, this SCAN is integrating motor and autonomic action planning, and it basically includes specific regions of the M1 and the somatomotor areas, somatomotor auxiliary areas, thalamus, posterior putamen, and also the cerebellum. And it's functionally connected also to that dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which, remember we talked before about that, and the cingulate cortex is basically thought to connect the thinking brain and the emotional brain. So this is it's linked into free will And it's also linked into the parietal regions representing movement intentions, and the insular regions, which are processing somatosensory activity, pain, and interoceptive visceral signals. So the insula is that area where everything sort of comes into multimodal integration inside the brain. And that multimodal integration is also accessed by the scan area of the motor cortex to make sure that all the stuff that's happening in there is appropriate for the movement that is being required to basically follow the emotional command that was given when I said, I want to pick up a glass of water. Remember going back to our example earlier. Now, what does all this mean? Well, it means that movement, whatever movement we're deciding to do, is so there's a common factor across this wide range of processes, and they all must be integrated in the organism if it's going to achieve its goals through movement while avoiding injury and maintaining physiological allostasis. So the scan provides a substrate for this integration, enabling pre-action anticipatory postural breathing, cardiovascular and arousal changes, such as shoulder tension, increased heart rate, or for instance, you can sometimes get butterflies in your stomach before you perform a movement. If you're, for instance, an athlete who's going to perform a specific type, repetitive, like a diver diving off a platform, going through the process, sometimes they will get, butterflies in their stomach. Finding that action and body control are melded into a common circuit that could help explain why mind and body states are so often interacting. So this is what is important. This is the new information. Now, I think a lot of us had sort of anticipated that we would find this, but we didn't actually find the true evidence for this until about 2 years ago. So some of you may not be aware of this. So that's why I wanted to present this stuff in this presentation. Now, you can get more information if you want. If you want to go to our website, ifn.net.au, or the YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and type in and search Better Brainwave, you'll come to our YouTube channel and you can get more information on this. Okay, well, thank you very much. And I think we're going to try and answer some questions then.
Dr. Beck, thank you so much for your outstanding presentation and sharing with us these amazing new discoveries. So you've mentioned a traditional understanding of movement combined with modern neuroscience. That was really our theme for today. So an overview of movement neurology, the motor cortex initiates the pyramidal cells, which project to the spinal cord, to synapse with the lower motor neurons, causing muscle contraction via neurotransmitter release at the muscle. And then the change in position is relayed back up the spinal cord to the thalamus and the sensory cortex. It's feedback of sensory and motor to determine accuracy of movements. When it comes to cortical control movement, the homunculus was identified back in the 1930s. And so with the motor cortex, our precentral gyrus, we have larger representation for things like our hands, face, lips, and even the feet have larger representation within the motor map. The legs are represented in the central sulcus, and so if we have a tumor there, that can actually affect both legs. And with the sensory cortex, our postcentral gyrus, that's our somatosensory information for movement and tactile stimulation, and it's crucial for our daily lives for survival. We need to know if we've accomplished our functional movements, and so we receive feedback to determine if we've accomplished our movement goals. Multiple systems are involved in movement control. So the motor cortex, the pyramidal cells, the spinal cord to the lower motor neurons to the muscles. And again, that feedback, muscle, spinal cord, brainstem, cerebellum, and cortex. And the basal ganglia controls information flow to the cortex. So it regulates information flow to the thalamus, which influences motor activity and other cognitive functions. The basal ganglia receives input from the cerebral cortex, processes and modulates this information, and then projects to the thalamus. The thalamus to the cortex information influences movement and cortical functions. And it plays a role in emotional regulation as well as cognitive functioning. And movement and psychological disorders can occur when the basal ganglia has dysfunction. And then we talked about the cerebellum. So this compares the command that was given and the outcome of that command in the muscles. So it's a feedback loop from the cerebellum to the thalamus and then the thalamus to the cortex. So does the thalamus alter the information to the cortex via the thalamocortical loops? The thalamus is the relay station. The modification is used by the cortex, the modification of that sensory input. And then advanced functional mapping techniques were used to determine the new motor cortex anatomy. So, utilizing resting state functional connectivity neuroimaging, which measures spontaneous brain activity when the patient is at rest, and then precision functional mapping neuroimaging to estimate metrics of brain function. And so, they've uncovered the cinguloopercular network, the CON, a brain network involved in executive functions, particularly those related to action control, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the medial superior frontal cortex, and the anterior insula, and then sometimes also the frontal operculum. So it's top-down control of both motor and cognitive functions, as well as pain processing. And you mentioned how pain can be produced to prevent you from moving certain muscles, where the brain wants to prevent you from hurting yourself. And then voluntary movement are part of goal-directed actions, so it's controlled by executive regions in the con. Neural activity preceding voluntary movements can first be detected in the rostral cingulate zone within the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and then the pre-supplementary motor area, and then the supplementary motor area, and then M1 or the motor cortex for movement. So we have a desire to move, which is actually an emotion. So the thinking brain activates the appropriate muscles to ensure the activity then happens. The pre-supplementary area coordinates those motor engrams. And with efferent copies of motor control, they're produced mirroring the motor cortex. So efferent copies go to a variety of different places, and the copies are received for correction, learning, and inhibition of movement. So it includes the primary somatosensory cortex, the cerebellum, and the striatum. And our efferent copies, like you described, they require high energetic reserves, but that's how important they are for survival, that we make these copies and create these engrams associated with movement. And then projections from the con act to prepare whole body preparation for movement. So projections from the anterior motor cortex, the con, to internal organs for preparatory sympathetic arousal for anticipation of movement. Post-movement error and pain signals are relayed primarily to the insula and the cingulate regions of the con, which then update future action plans. And the con is critical for action in physiologic control, arousal, error perception, as well as pain. And so if we compare the old and the new homunculi, to accomplish whole body functions, it requires action implementation, as well as postural and gross motor control, regulating arousal, coordinating breathing, and then internal organ processes and whole body metabolic and physiologic control. So the motor cortex is projecting to the con for control of full body mechanisms. So it's no longer just a projection directly to the pyramidal neurons for activation of single and muscles, but now we see that it's more whole body coordination. So two behavioral control systems within the human motor cortex: effector-specific circuits for precise and isolated movements. Second, integrative output system, which is a somatocognitive action network, the SCAN. It's more important for controlling the organism as a whole. It's functionally connected to the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex regions, linked to free will, and parietal regions for movement intentions, and also the insular regions for somatosensory and interoception. And then integration of movement and function is essential for survival. So the scan enables pre-action, anticipatory postural, breathing, cardiovascular, and arousal changes. And really, we see how the whole mind-body states often interact in order to create movement, which is so important for our survival as human beings. Dr. Beck, thank you so much. This is just outstanding and such an interesting new perspective to our traditional understanding of movement that we've all learned, throughout our classes throughout, over time. Couple of questions for you. So putting this all into action, when it comes to creating neurorehabilitation plans, is there a way that we can help, or would it be beneficial to start considering the desire component to help people have more of a desire to move, which could then prepare their bodies, prepare their brain to then prepare their body for more specific movements as part of their neurorehabilitation? Or how can we better take this information and update our neurorehabilitation strategies?
Right. So I think that's actually an amazing idea. And that's kind of what has flowed out of all this, is that we can ask people to think about moving and think about the movements they want to move or they want to do. And that activates up to, in some instances, 80% of these, you know, reflexive arcs that happen. So in other words, if you just think about moving, blood flow changes to the movement that you're thinking about. If you just think about moving, things get rerouted, emotional hormones get released, all kinds of different things start to happen. So it's a kind of new approach to rehab where we have to think about all of the things that we're asking people to bring into movement, not just from the bottom up, which is sort of, I think, traditional sort of physiotherapy, get them to move the muscles that they can't move for whatever reason, and not even thinking about, okay, in order to move those muscles, what else has to happen? Now, I think, this is one of the things that I think chiropractors and specifically chiropractors have considered a long time ago, like going way back to the original founders of chiropractic. They were looking at, how does a subluxation affect all these other things like blood flow and hormonal distribution, different proprioceptive aspects of movement. And this is kind of proving that they were actually right, that all this stuff is actually happening inside the brain.
Yeah.
Whereas before we didn't realize that. We just sort of had that idea that this must be happening, right? Right? It must be happening. But we didn't really have the evidence
Sure.
until now. And
Interesting.
now it's all starting to flow out. So this is very exciting stuff. And that's why I wanted everybody to know about it, basically, or at least have a chance to go and read about it and know that it's happening. Because I think the dream is starting to be realized.
Yes,
That it's,
absolutely.
it's all starting to come out now.
Yeah.
And it's just quite exciting to be involved at this point in time.
It really is. And if you don't mind if I have asked one final question here, from a postural
Absolutely.
perspective, because of course at the American Posture Institute, we're always interested in ways that we can improve postural correction. So if we think about this desire to move, that's more intentional goal-directed movements, how could we tap into this from a more postural perspective, which of course is going to be more our endurance muscles. We're not consciously thinking about our posture, 24 hours a day to resist gravity. Any ideas how we can make that connection specific for postural control?
Well, I think what this new evidence is showing us is that as we sort of anticipated, most of the postural stuff is reflexive in nature.
Hmm.
So it's out of our voluntary sort of control. So we're not sort of controlling the inner muscles of our vertebrae, voluntarily when we sort of bend to the side or bend over or whatever. That's all happening automatically from these motor engrams that we've developed since since we were kids. So I think it's a good thing. It's kind of a two-edged sword for posture because it's a good thing because it's pretty hard to lose those. Once they're embedded, they're there, and that cascade happens. But it's also hard to reteach that once we lose it. And so it's going back to that old, 10,000 reps. We got to do the 10,000 reps, every day type thing to remind and reconnect all of those engrams that have been lost, if they have been lost.
Sure.
Um, but what they did, another thing they found very interesting in this research was even massive strokes didn't take out all the engrams.
Wow.
So those engrams were still there, and people could, kids, they could have a stroke when they were very young, and they would still develop, no, almost normal movement and normal posture. So those engrams are very, very embedded in our genetics almost.
Interesting.
So I think that's good news, actually.
Yeah,
Now, it's harder to teach that stuff once they're gone, but that's why we do what we do. If it was easy, everybody'd do it, right?
for sure. That's why we're still learning more.
Absolutely. And that's what the quest is. The quest is to keep learning and to keep
Absolutely.
applying that knowledge to help people.
Yes. Knowledge isn't power, it's the application of that knowledge that's truly powerful and can make a
Yes,
tremendous
your
impact on your patients. Wonderful.
wiser words have never been said. That's right.
Thank you. And as we wrap up another great session today on the Virtual Neurology Summit, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Beck for his excellent work in clinical neuroplasticity. And to all of our viewers, I'd like to acknowledge you. Thank you for your commitment to brain-based correction and objective clinical results. I'm Dr. Krista, your host of the Virtual Neurology Summit. Be sure to check out the Postural Neurology program to get certified in brain-based postural correction. Stay tuned, and we'll see you on the next Neuro Masterclass of the Virtual Neurology Summit.